I think you got the message. Welcome back to the Library of Mistakes. Thank you for joining us. There are plenty of room, seats up at the front, so please come and join us. And if you can't find a seat, we'll put some benches out at the back. It's a pretty full house tonight. So welcome, I'm Russell Napier, the keeper of the Library of Mistakes, and I'm delighted to welcome to the Library of Mistakes my friend Charles Dallara. Charles is now an advisory partner with Partners Group, but he's here to talk about an episode in Greece. Charles first visited Greece in 1970, not in a financial capacity, but as a gunnery expert on a destroyer.
Yes.
And that was his first introduction to Greece. And little did he know that a few years later he'd be back. After the Navy, he ended up quite quickly in the US working for Nicholas Brady, the Secretary of the Treasury, in the late 1980s. That involved restructuring of emerging market debt, something that many of you will know as the Brady bonds. Charles was heavily involved in that, a little bit in private practice. And I believe you brought Poland and Turkey back to the international sovereign debt market. After a bit of a lapse, after
yes.
a long absence, back they came. Then became the chief executive of the Institute of International Finance, which was the body set up in the original emerging markets crisis of 82, 83, and ran that for 20 years and fulfilled lots of roles. The IIF, I think, sort of grew and grew to do lots of things in terms of representing the banks and also dealing with some of the issues of regulation and banking. And that is why when the Greek crisis came, it was Charles they turned to. Knew a little bit about banking, knew a lot about restructuring, and he was the man they called for to try and work this out, representing the private sector creditors, which were more than just banks, but there were lots of, as we're about to hear, there was lots of public sector involvement in this as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, Charles, thank you for coming all this way. It's a tremendous book, by the way. There's nothing quite like Charles's book in terms of an insider writing about what happens and how this is done. At least if you know of one, let me know. But as I said to Charles, this will be the textbook the next time it happens. They'll be picking up Dallara's Euroshock. Charles, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Russell. When I heard you ringing that bell, I thought I was back in the Navy and it was general quarters and I better get out of my bunk. But it's a real pleasure to be here at the Library of Mistakes. You know, when Russell first mentioned this library to me a decade or so ago, I was a little perplexed at first. I thought, wow, it must be the world's largest library if it's a library of mistakes. And then I realized, of course, quite quickly that it was a library focused on financial and economic mistakes. And then I still surmised that must still be a hell of a library because of all of the litany of financial and economic mistakes over the years. It, of course, is much more than just a library. And I think we're all surrounded by these rather fascinating books here tonight. But I think what Russell and his colleagues have done with this library, I think, is build a platform to reflect upon economic and financial mistakes, to debate them, to discuss them, and to create a framework for learning from our mistakes, because that's what so much of this is about. It reminded me of a quote which I recalled vaguely from one of the philosophers in Greece. His name was Plutarch, and he was a student and a devotee of Plato. And around the time of the turn from BC to AD, he said, to make no mistakes is not in the power of humankind. But from their errors and mistakes, the wise and the good will gain wisdom for the future. And I think this is what this is all about, isn't it? Certainly the experience I had in dealing with Greek debt was full of mistakes. And there are almost so many here that it's difficult to concentrate on a handful. But let me first take you back 4 days and 15 years. If you'll just roll the mind back a little bit, we're talking October 6th, 2009. what happened that day that's relevant for the story that I'm going to share with you. Now, I know this gentleman, Paul, here might have the answer, but maybe we should find somebody else first, because it's too easy for him. He's a Greek expat. Anyone else? October 6th, 2009. It was the day that George Papandreou was elected as the next prime minister of Greece. Now, George was an erudite, American-educated man whose father had served as a Greek prime minister, whose grandfather was one of the most distinguished politicians and leaders of Greece in the post-war era. And so you might think that he was prepared for what was to come. But that election turned out to be, for him, a proverbial poison chalice, just like Macbeth's in the Shakespeare story. Why? Because he walked into an economic situation which was rife with difficulty. And the reasons go deep into Greek culture, Greek economic habits, Greek government management and mismanagement. But at least on the surface, what's important to recall now is that when they came into office, they announced that Greece had a budget deficit for the prior year in the range of 5%. And that was no big surprise to anyone. And of course, the new finance minister, George Papakonstantinou, said, I'm going to tackle this and we're going to get this under control. And the markets paid absolutely no attention, as markets tend to do. In the long run, markets have this terrific power to drive the allocation of capital in sensible directions. But in the short run, it's just a crapshoot. It really is. And that's what was happening. They were not terribly concerned because, after all, the markets had had a good time investing in Greek bonds for almost a full decade. Well, a couple of weeks later, the finance minister announced that, to his chagrin, they had discovered that the deficit was 8%, not 5%. Well, the markets raised a couple of eyebrows, but that was about it. You saw no serious disruption in the markets. It's important to recall that this was a time when the world's financial markets were still recovering from the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. This had been a terribly tempestuous and painful period for virtually the entire world economy. And anyone who was working or in finance in those days remembers how turbulent it was. The Americans had managed to develop this very artful system of investing in securitized mortgages, which no one, and I mean no one, could properly value. The rating agencies made a stab at that, but it's clear that that failed. And so when all of this burst and broke apart in the fall of 2008 with the collapse, with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, the world was in the throes of huge disruption. A Scot who was leading your country at that time, Gordon Brown, was really the right man in the right place, because I had worked with him when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I give a good bit of credit to Gordon Brown for steering the G7 through a period of turbulence and stabilizing the world economy. So the last thing anyone was concerned about in the fall of 2009 was this little country in southeastern Europe whose economy is 10% the size of the British economy, 5% the size of the German economy. Why should anybody be terribly concerned? Well, the markets weren't concerned. A few weeks later, the finance minister announced that, woe be unto him, the deficit was 12%. The markets stood up and raised their eyebrows and began to run for cover. They didn't stop running until he announced 3 weeks later that the deficit for the prior year was 15%, 3 times the scale that it had been understood when they took office. How did this happen, and what happened as a result of this? Well, the markets completely froze Greece out at that point. There was no willingness, except for the Greek banks who were inside the Greek system and trapped and were forced to refinance Greek bonds on a biweekly basis. There was no willingness of any other external creditor to roll over Greek bonds. Maturing debts were allowed to expire, and Greece began to financially suffocate. This began to generate a growing sense of anxiety, and a lot of investors around the world thought, oh, Greece has a serious problem, but we can isolate it to Greece. The difficulty with that perception was that this was happening at a time when Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and another country much larger than Greece, Italy, was also in financial difficulty. Before we knew it, the entire Eurozone was under a severe cloud of instability. George Papandreou, the prime minister, proudly thought he could resolve this without Berlin, without Brussels, without the IMF. I got an unanticipated call in January of 2010 from his office saying, would I meet with the Prime Minister in Davos in a couple of weeks? And of course, I said yes. I scrambled around and realized that something was happening, but I hadn't, like many in the markets, I hadn't really been focused on Greece's economic problems. At that point, it had begun to get my attention. But when I met with him, he was rather convinced that he could solve it on his own. And would I, as the head of the Institute of International Finance, put out a few good words for him in the capital markets? Well, I tried to persuade him that we were not at a stage where a few good words from me would make much difference. But he was engaged in a phase of wishful thinking, and to a certain extent, so were many other officials. I think it's important to recognize that Europe had invested politically so heavily in the creation of the euro that no one in the European decision-making structure, bankers, finance ministers, presidents, prime ministers, wanted to think about the possibility that a member of the Eurozone could go bankrupt. If you step back for a moment, just a few years earlier, the euro had been created with great fanfare in 1999, I think, was the inauguration of it in a virtual sense. One of the best, I don't applaud decisions made out of Washington or London just because they're made by distinguished governments, and I wasn't personally overly impressed with a lot of what was coming out of Europe around that time. But I do recall having discussions with key British officials in the run-up to the creation of the euro and being convinced that they were right in keeping the pound and not becoming part of the euro. Now, I quickly should differentiate that from being a member of the European Commission and the European Union, which is a whole different kettle of fish. I'm sure you would understand better than I do. But the fact of the matter is that the creation of the euro had become the crown jewel in the creation of an integrated economic Europe that had been under construction since the creation of the Steel Union in 1951, I think it was. And here they had finally created their common currency. As a young Treasury officer, I'd been in the room in 1979 when European officials were bemoaning the weak dollar, and they were complaining endlessly that we should do something about it. Well, it happened on another October 6th, 30 years prior to the election of George Papandreou. Paul Volcker did do something about it. He announced a sharp reversal in monetary policy in the United States, which led temporarily to a recession. But it also led to a stronger dollar, and it revived the U.S. economy after this period of recession. It did not stop, however, European officials from thinking that they needed their own competitor with the dollar. And so 20 years later, we see the euro created. Was it an act of economic policy? Not really. Of course, it had a fundamental economic dimension to it. But it was, like a lot of things, a political statement. I remember having dinner with a gentleman who many of you may have heard of. He passed away, sadly, almost a decade ago. His name was Hans Tietmeyer. Hans Tietmeyer was the head of the Bundesbank in the run-up to the creation of the euro. He was initially an ardent opponent of the euro, thinking, for good reason, the Deutschmark has worked pretty damn well for us. Why don't we hang on to it? Well, at that dinner that night we had in Rome, which was in the spring of 1998, as the decision was being made about who would become part of the euro, with the benefit of a few glasses of wine, he slammed his fist on the table, kind of stunned everyone at the dinner table, and said, "The lira and the drachma will become part of the euro over my dead body." Ooh. Well, I had lunch with him back in 2013, a year or so before he passed away. And I said, "Well, I'm glad to see you're still here, Hans, with the euro." The euro has had both the drachma and the lira as part of it now for quite some time. And he said to me, "I always knew it was a political project." Unfortunately, not everyone in Germany remembered that, and not everyone in Greece remembered that. But the reality was that Greece was not an original member. Italy was. Greece managed to talk its way in, maybe manipulate its data to get in the early 2000s. So by the time the euro became a market reality in 2002, Greece had become a member. So what happened? Talk about a library of mistakes. This could fill volumes. We're talking about investors who should have known better, who work for major financial institutions, many of the larger banks of Europe, pension funds, insurance firms, hedge funds, a few banks from America and Asia, but mostly we're talking about European-based financial institutions who thought this is a great way to earn some return. In one of your, Russell, 21 lessons from financial history, you quoted, and I think the quote was from Bagehot, that John Bull can tolerate many things, but he can't tolerate a 2% bond. What was meant by that is that a low return on a bond becomes very unpleasant for an investor over a period of time. And he was quoted, I think, as saying, correct me if I'm wrong, Russell, that one of the greatest negative forces in financial history is the search for yield. So what happened? In 2002, investors all over Europe thought, what a deal. We get Greek returns, but German risk. They assumed Germany would pick up the tab for all of the mistakes that were made by any other member of the euro. They're big, they're strong. No matter what they say, they'll look after their weaker brethren. Politically, that made some sense, because you would have thought that when Greece and Italy were invited into the club, that Germany and the Netherlands and other northern, stronger countries would have realized that there may come a time when they couldn't pay their bills. But the reality was that billions of funds were poured into Greece over the course of this decade. By the time the crisis erupted in late 2009, early 2010. There were 250 billion of outstanding private loans and bonds to Greece. 250 billion for a relatively small economy. And very little of that had been put to work to promote efficiency or competitiveness. Now, anyone who knows anything about the history of modern Greece, and most of us have had the good fortune to have studied at least a touch of classical Greece, and most of us, at least I am, somewhat bedazzled by what still persists from the beauties of philosophy, of economics, of democracy, and of so many other playwrights, so many other elements of classical Greece that influence our society today. Modern Greece is another story. There's a gentleman from Edinburgh named Rodney Beaton. I think that's his name. Roderick Beaton. I don't know if any of you know him, but he's an historian. And he wrote a marvelous book a few years ago called Biography of a Nation. Now, if you read that book, and you also read maybe some supplementary material on the details of economic management and mismanagement of Greece, you realize that this is a country that has been in default for virtually half of its existence. Virtually half of the 200 years that Greece has been around. And it started right down the road in London when Lord Byron decided to become a great fan of Greece. Even before it was a country, Greece was bankrupt. It had managed to persuade a bunch of British bankers to loan them, I don't remember the numbers right now, I think it was not a huge amount, but to loan sizable funds to build some ships to win its independence from the Ottoman Empire. The ships never got built. I mean, they never even were fully constructed. And surprise, surprise, the money was never repaid. Well, this story, and I don't want to be too cynical about it, because the Greeks didn't have an easy time establishing their sovereignty. They had kings appointed from Germany, from Denmark. They were constantly under the political tutelage of a combination of powerful European countries, including Great Britain, Germany, France, and Russia. At any point in time over the last 200 years, they had been financed by and then become indebted to bankers or creditors from these countries. And then if you look at the more modern history of Greece, where the end of World War II brought peace for most every country in the world except for two. Two civil wars persisted. And we all know how one of those ended up. China ended up becoming a communist country and is now increasingly an adversary of the West. The other story is not as well known unless you are from Greece, but the Greek Civil War persisted for some 5 to 6 years after the end of World War II, and was only ultimately won by the nationalist forces with the financial and military support of first the British, and then the British pulled out and the Americans came in. I mention all of this because it has been a rough 2 centuries to establish itself as a functioning country for Greece. Over the last 60 years, political parties were developed and democracy began to take hold. However, this democracy was associated with an economic clientelism that built statism, not competitiveness, that built a bloated bureaucracy, not an efficient economic structure. And so if you take that forward into Greece's membership in the Eurozone, you can see this was a crisis ripe to erupt. And that's what happened. I was pulled into it to lead and then eventually to co-lead with a good friend of mine who is now the chairman of BNP Paribas, the negotiations with Europe and with Greece over restructuring its debt. This was extremely controversial. I've been involved in sovereign debt issues for virtually all of my career. During the 1980s, I kind of grew up professionally in the Treasury Department, holding the hands of Latin debtors, trying to keep their economies afloat while the bankers rolled over loans to them. There was no reduction in debt, however, in those days. It was all roll over, and we'll cut the margin of your interest payments just slightly to make you feel a little bit better. But this debt problem in Latin America was kind of pushed forward for 7 or 8 years until Secretary Nicholas Brady arrived, a person who is still a close friend of mine, and Russell knows him very well as well, who had the courage to launch the Brady Plan, which enabled us to do something that had not been done in modern finance with sovereign debt. It enabled us to actually reduce the level of debt for these debtors so that the cloud of debt overhang was removed. That was a dramatic change in the way in which sovereign debt was approached, and it did, at least for a generation, help clear away the Latin debt problem. In the case of Greece, no one wanted to contemplate a debt restructuring exercise because it was verboten. We had leaders, including the head of the European Central Bank, Jean-Claude Trichet, who fervently resisted the notion that any member of the Eurozone would not, as he put it, stand by their signature, would not therefore honor their debt. But the reality is that Greece did not have the money to pay, and the IMF in Europe could not muster sufficient funds to enable them to pay. And so a dance began. We stuck our head in, and for the first time in modern financial history, the creditors, which I represented, stood up and said, we need to restructure and reduce some of this debt. Well, there was a rather shocking turnabout. It was kind of sovereign debt upside down because you had the creditors telling the debtor, I'm willing to take a haircut, so let's sit around the table and negotiate how large the haircut is. This was an extraordinarily odd negotiation for that reason. It started on a difficult point, but it became even odder when I was told that my counterpart in the negotiations would not be the Greek finance minister. It would be the deputy finance minister of Italy. So I remember walking around a hotel room, scratching my head, thinking, as far as I know, Italy's in big financial trouble as well. There's a guy named Berlusconi running the show there who cannot get along with his finance minister. They fight with one another publicly every other day. The Italian bond market is in utter disarray. And you're expecting me to negotiate a resolution to Greek debt with the deputy minister there? I was told by Jean-Claude Juncker, who was running the finance ministers of Europe at the time, said, Charles, that's the only way we can think about it. And so I set about to meet with a gentleman who, very capable Italian official, but the first moment I met with him, we had a group of about a dozen on each side of the table, creditors on our side, officials from the Commission, the ECB, the IMF, and Greece, and then scattered other officials from Germany and the Netherlands and a few other countries. He said, well, could we have a private meeting beforehand? And I said, sure. He said, you know, I don't really want to be here. I said, well, I'm not thrilled about being here either, but we've got a job to do. We've got a job to do, and so let's get it done. He said, you know, he pulled out an Italian newspaper, and even though my family roots are Italian, I'm not that fluent in it today. But I could tell that it was just one more article about Berlusconi and his finance minister fighting with one another, and the bond market going through the floor as a result of this. And he said, this is what I've got to cope with. And if I negotiate a restructuring for Greece's debt, the presumption will be that Italy will be next in line. And I turned around and said, if we don't resolve Greece's debt, Italy will be next in line. And this was the debate which we had for months that summer. Finally, in the fall of that year, and we were told constantly that the governmental side of this, the Greek side, the Italian side, the Brussels side, however you want to call it, did not have a mandate to thoroughly and firmly negotiate with me. But yet we pushed forward, we had discussions, we exchanged ideas. But they kept telling me, the Italian deputy finance minister, no, we don't really have full authority to negotiate with you. And I finally just walked out of the room and said, well, get me somebody who does. An hour later, I was in front of Chancellor Merkel and President Sarkozy. And they said, Mr. Dallara, we do run the show here. That's in effect what Sarkozy said. He really liked to be self-important. And he pranced around the room like nothing I'd ever seen before. And lectured us, yelled at us, threatened us. There were only two of us, Jean Lemierre and myself, in the room at the time. But at least they did have authority to speak for European governments. At least they presumed that authority, and they did have the stature and the leadership. It was Merkel who brought some sanity to the process and actually worked with me and my colleague, Lemierre, to find some basic frame of understanding for reducing Greece's debt by roughly half. It took us another 6 months to iron out the details, and it took another new government in Greece, because as soon as we had reached agreement on this restructuring, reached agreement in broad terms, I should say, George Papandreou decided he was going to initiate a referendum. And it was initially going to be on the adjustment program. But then Sarkozy and others said, no, if this is a referendum, it'll be on Greece's membership in the euro. And that turned the whole process topsy-turvy. Papandreou resigned. And there was a silver lining to all of this, because as I said to Paul earlier, a gentleman who had known quite well for many years, urbane, knowledgeable, educated, former central banker, who had been the deputy head of the European Central Bank, Lucas Papademos, was surprisingly appointed as the technocrat to run a technocratic government until new elections could be held. The silver lining in all this is that I knew Lucas, he knew me, and we trusted one another. And we actually, even though we were on opposite sides of the table, in a certain sense, we actually became partners in trying to work toward a solution. 6 months later, we reached agreement, and in March of 2012, 107 billion euro were eliminated, just wiped off the face of the balance sheets of these banks, and another 100 billion was stretched out over 30 years. One would have thought that this really solved the Greek debt problem. The reality is, however, and this is why economics can never be separated from politics, can never be separated from institutions, can never be separated from so many of the realities in any sovereign state, cultural, historic, you name it. The fabric of democracy in Greece had been stretched so thin by then, partly because of mismanagement of the adjustment program by the IMF, that the Greek people, totally fatigued by these two sets of governments, the two sets of political parties, the conservative New Democracy Party and the liberal or socialist PASOK Party, they were so fatigued that they decided to try something new. So they went with this new party, Syriza, which was full of socialist, quasi-former communists, and this set back the country another 4 years. Finally, in 2019, the Conservative Party won an election, created a credible government, which has now begun to implement reforms. Suddenly, the benefits of this debt restructuring began to become more evident, because when we had not only eliminated a huge amount of the debt, we had stretched out the remaining debt, as I mentioned, for 30 years with highly concessional rates. The markets began to look at Greece again in 2019 and 20 and said, this seems like a credible government. And look at the debt. It's still high, but the debt service obligations are very manageable. The result is that now there seems to be a good trend in this economy. And a lot of people want to celebrate victory. I'm not quite there yet. Why? What do you think the unemployment rate is? It's still 9.9%. What do you think the youth unemployment rate is? It's still 19.9%. Both of those numbers are roughly double what you have in Scotland here today. And I'm sure that unemployment is a real issue for you. So imagine even after 4 to 5 years of economic recovery, the reality is this economy is just now getting back on its feet. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, but the reality is to change the way the Greek economy works, you will have to change so many fundamental patterns of human behavior that it could take generations to build the kind of competitive economy that Greece is capable of. One has hoped, however, and there's growing evidence, that the leaders of Greece have learned lessons. They have tried to digitalize the tax payment system, for example, because no matter what Adam Smith said years ago about the key qualities of any good tax system, which I think he characterized as certainty, convenience, equity, fair sharing of the tax burden. There was one more fourth element of that, Russell, and I don't remember what it was right now. Oh, efficiency. No matter what Adam Smith sketched out, because those still are the parameters which many governments look to when they try to shape fiscal policy. Greece has hardly learned any of those. The reality is that there is an embedded cultural aversion to paying taxes in Greece. And you can say this dates back to the time of the Ottomans, and it does. But the reality is that these problems will take time before it is recognized that the old system, which was characterized easily by the simple expression, I'll vote for you if you hire 3 of my cousins, but I don't want to pay any taxes. Now, anybody can see that that's not a system that's going to work for a country for a very long time, but that was the system that guided. In a way, it was the framework of interaction between Greek citizens and the government for many decades. Have lessons been learned, and what can we take away from this litany of mistakes? Capital markets are still inclined to invest way too much in sovereign bonds around the world without understanding the underlying risks. And governments are still inclined to borrow to the hilt if they have access to the markets, believing that because some investment banker comes to see them and tell them they can raise another $300 million Euro bond out there with no trouble, and the interest charges will be 5.5% or 4.5% and 6.5%. There's an utter incapacity in many debt management offices of sovereigns around the world in looking down the long road and understanding the risk to their people. The bankers who made these stupid loans have generally not lost their jobs. Oh, a few of them may have. But the cost to the creditor of making this mistake, yes, it's not inconsequential for the firm. When these write-offs were announced, the stock price of BNP Paribas and Deutsche Bank was not 3 or 5% the day it was announced, but it came back. At least it did for some of these institutions. The cost to the population of Greece was enormous. Suicides went through the roof. Out of an 11 million population, almost 1 billion left the country. Manage the talent drain. The point I'm trying to make is that some of these lessons learned need to be baked into a more effective global financial system. And Europe needs to think seriously about how it can cope with another sovereign debt crisis when it arises. They have still not built a sufficiently large financial firewall that they can do that without the IMF. And the IMF has still not learned how to negotiate with a country that is part of a common currency zone. The process of institutionalizing learning from the experience of Greece has not advanced anywhere near as much as it should. And I think this is why at the end of my book you have a number of suggestions for how to move that forward. It's not easy to do, though, because we're in a period where Europe really should be trying to strengthen the integrated framework of the Eurozone. They should be trying to build a common framework for resolving banks which run into trouble, but they've made only limited progress. They should be trying to build a common fiscal framework. When Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand, and before him Giscard d'Estaing, first envisaged the euro, there was going to be a common currency and a common fiscal policy. The common fiscal policy never happened. These are some of the lessons which we need to chew on in order to process them into the global financial system if we're to avoid another Greece in the future. Thank you for your time and attention tonight. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Yep.
You need a hand up, are you okay?
I'm fine.
These books are called the Bankers' Magazines, and we have a complete collection upstairs from the 19th century. So if you want to know what bankers were thinking about Greece in 1842, then please come back to the Library of Mistakes, and you can hear a contemporaneous opinion on Greece and all the way through economic history. I want to start in the weeds and then get out of the weeds. And it's really about the IMF, because you've been dealing with the IMF through your career. It's clearly changed in its policies. You had a throwaway line in there, mismanagement of the economic adjustment program. I feel there's a lot more in that. Do you want to say what you think? You say in the book, but do you want to say what you think they got wrong and what they've learned or not learned about economic adjustment programs?
Well, I think this was particularly poorly managed by the IMF. I served on the board of the IMF for 5.5 years. And when I left, I was asked by someone, I left voluntarily, my term had another 2 or 3 years, and I'd been asked to take another senior position at the U.S. Treasury, and I was asked, how do you feel about the IMF? And I said to that person, I want to get out the door before I become completely cynical about the IMF. And the reason I said that is because multilateral institutions have a way of becoming institutionally self-aggrandizing. They develop their own sense of who they ought to be and what they ought to be, somewhat independent of their shareholders and their members' interests. In this case, the IMF was very much under the thumb of one person, I hate to say it, and that was the German finance minister. And although in many ways a good man, he was a bitter man. He'd been injured. He was in a wheelchair. He believed that debtors should pay for their sins. When I was a young Treasury officer and I was sent to Mexico in the early 80s to work with them on their debt problem, I went along with a senior Treasury man. And when we met with the Mexican finance minister, I started to tell the minister what I thought he should do to fix his problems. And I probably got in a tone of lecturing, totally inappropriate for a 32-year-old mid-level economist. So at the end of the meeting, my boss pulled me aside and said, Charles, the content of what you said was fair enough. I said, but we're not down here to lecture the Mexicans. We're here to help them solve a problem, because their problem is our problem. The money they owe is to American banks. And if that money doesn't come back, the capital of these banks is going to be wiped out. So just keep in mind that you have to be a partner to them. I'm afraid the German officials, particularly this one official, never learned this. And he took this and drove the IMF. And the IMF also suffered from weak leadership at the time. It had a new managing director, Christine Lagarde, who had no economics training. She was not able to second guess the staff on issues. And she gained that experience over time. But this was initially right at the beginning of her term because of the problems which Strauss-Kahn had, and he'd been fired and pushed out the door. The reality was that they drove an austerity program in Greece far beyond its point of product It's a point of usefulness. And when they kept insisting on further belt tightening, it drove the economy further into the ground. As my friend Jean Lemaitre and I said, it's like chasing a rabbit down the hole. You never catch it. And, 4 years later, the IMF issued a mea culpa. And they said, oh, we got it wrong. We got the income multiplier from the fiscal multiplier from our analysis wrong, and we did not understand the full negative impact of what we were asking the Greeks to do. Of course, to be honest with you, the Greeks had not fully implemented many of the commitments they had made. But the IMF really made serious mistakes in how they designed the program. And I think part of this has to do with the fact that they were not accustomed to working with a country that's part of a currency zone. Plus, the IMF hires only PhD economists in general. And when I was director at the fund, I asked the leadership to start bringing in some other talent, some other skill sets, some development economists, some historians, some cultural experts, because you can't fix an economy unless you really understand the essence of what drives the economy. And you can't understand that just from macroeconomic textbooks. And the IMF, sadly, has never really changed the way it builds team expertise. Until it does, I find it hard to really trust their skill set as much as I would like to, because these are dedicated, highly trained economists. But you can't take a cookie-cutter approach to fixing economic problems in advanced economies, just as you can't take it to emerging market economies.
It's interesting, when I look back at what you were doing in the late 80s with the other members that you were working with that I know, and Terry Checkey at the EM, I mean, you were pragmatists first and foremost. You weren't theorists.
No.
And what happened? How did the theorists take over? Because I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Well, I think the IMF was built around a certain framework of so-called monetary approach to balance of payments adjustment. And it concentrated on controlling money supply as a key to adjusting the balance of payments problems of a country. The whole rationale for the IMF in the early years was focused on not necessarily correcting underlying fiscal problems, but correcting the balance of payments problem. And this philosophy, which was born out of this particular economic model, has persisted over the years, and it has its utility. But again, I think it has its serious limitations when it comes to understanding how to work with governments to fix deeply embedded structural problems in their economies, because short-term fixes for an economy like Greece or many economies around the world don't really work. They may work for the capital markets. They may lead somebody to declare victory. And, when Greece a year and a half ago was granted investment grade rating in the markets, I got a lot of notes from friends saying, wow, look at what happened. This is a complete success story. And I said, hold your horses a little bit. There's still a lot of work to be done, and I think that's the reality of economic reform and change.
Okay. Now, one specific policy, because I was in Asia during the Asian financial crisis. I think 4 in total countries went to the IMF, but the one that was notable is the one that didn't. It's called Malaysia. And what Malaysia did as a way of getting around this is imposed a thing called exchange controls. Shock, horror, IMF appalled. You're involved in a restructuring where the IMF endorsed exchange controls. First of all, can you tell us whose idea it was? Obviously, everybody had to agree on it, but where did the idea come from that capital controls, exchange controls should be part of this particular restructuring? And how did everybody agree on that? Because it had been absolutely anathema, really, up until this, until Iceland anyway.
Well, there was such an utter collapse in confidence in the Greek financial system that without some degree of exchange controls, the fear was that the entire Greek banking system would completely collapse. And that was a real risk as the run on the bank's deposit structure in the Greek banking community became quite energized, unfortunately. And so I think the imposition of exchange controls was necessary. Some of the implementation of those exchange controls I was never fully comfortable with. And then, of course, you had the implementation subsequently of exchange controls in Cyprus, where accounts were actually seized. They were never seized in the case of Greece.
The central bank governor of Cyprus has written the book, it's in here. He said it was the European Commission who wanted capital controls in that case.
I think they had been an ardent supporter of that. I think trying to protect as well the fiscal position of the European Commission. I think the European Commission had created a stabilization fund around this time, but it was woefully insufficient to cope with Greece, much less cope with Italy. And again, we were debating constantly, if we restructure Greek debt, what happens to Italy? And there was a camp, which I pretty much was at the forefront of, thinking that if you don't lance the boil of Greece, Italy will go down with Greece. There were others who said if you do restructure Greek debt, Italy will go down. So it was a tough call. In the end of the day, of course, we know that Italy was not forced into restructuring, and I think it was just as well. Of course, the reality is that if you look at Italian debt today, if you look at French debt, you have to be concerned. You have to be concerned because the framework for stabilizing a country that's part of the Eurozone without a debt restructuring is still not there.
Yeah.
And frankly, if you look at France in particular today, where you see a very unstable government, which is already struggling to put into place a so-called austerity budget, where you've got a weak center holding together, and the political left and the political right in France are like wolves at the door of this new government. I'm quite concerned about where this leads us in terms of stabilizing the French economy in the short run. Mm.
You said in your presentation something that this library is really all about, that finance and economics is also about politics, sociology, culture, and throughout this book you've got great quotes from great Greeks. Let me read one because I think it sums it all up. Just because this is Pericles writing in 431 BC, just because you do not take an interest in politics does not mean that politics won't take an interest in you.
Pericles was a smart man.
Yeah. This is a Gordian knot because when Indonesia was Indonesia, you negotiated with one party. So you're negotiating with, theoretically, every member of the European Union because everybody was putting some money into this. I think the whole Union, not just the Eurozone. I think the United Kingdom put some money in as well.
Yes, but not a lot. I think that most of the burden of it fell on the members of the Eurozone as well as the IMF.
And then you had the IMF, you had the ECB and the European Commission. How do you negotiate? I mean, this is completely different.
Well, it was a multi-headed nightmare to deal with, I must say, particularly when the person across the table doesn't want to be there. I think that in the end of the day, you have to utilize and build relationships and develop trust, and it's why I come back to Lucas Papademos making such a difference when he became the Prime Minister of Greece. He had not, and still has not today, one political bone in his body. But he was a highly respected economist. He'd been a central banker for years. Everyone knew he could be trusted. I had worked with him for a good 20 years in dealing with other economic issues. And so there comes a time when professional politicians may need to be pushed aside by technocratic governments. And in this case, they only stood aside for 7 months. They turned it back over to a new democracy government, which did not a bad job, to be honest with you, in trying to get the country stabilized. But at that point, the disgust of the Greek citizenry was so great that they just decided to get rid of both these parties. And after decades of incompetent economic policy, and I hate to be too severe, but because there were periods of solid economic leadership in Greece, but that was not the common theme, unfortunately, over the course of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I have rarely seen a civil service that was so poorly prepared. You know, for 15 years, I've been, in effect, a civil servant. Now, yes, I was a presidential appointee for the last half of that time, but I, in effect, had a public service background. And I'd worked with public servants all over the world. And so many, unfortunately, of the Greek public servants were appointed because of family connections, not because of skill sets. And it was symptomatic of the difficulty which Greece had in coping with its own economic realities.
And of course, Italy had two sets of technocrats. They had the Monti technocrats, then they had the Draghi technocrats. So part of Italy's path through this was with technocrats coming in.
Well, that's true, and they lasted somewhat longer, and I think it made a difference. I would have preferred. I asked Lucas, why don't you throw your hat in the political ring, and he wouldn't contemplate it because he felt, look, this is not my forte, and I respect him for that. Yes. But I still think that in the absence of his presence, this whole thing could have crashed and burned.
So we're going to go to questions. And I want to read a bit from the book, because you passed over a little bit some of the drama of your meeting with Mr. Sarkozy, but you do it much more eloquently in the book, so let me read it. So, Sarkozy opened the meeting by standing up and suggesting that before Merkel outlined their positions on substance to Jean and myself, that he would say, in quotation marks, what was in their hearts. When I heard that and saw him begin to prance from one corner of the room to the other, it felt like the circus had come to town, and we were going to discover what was under the tent. Sarkozy then launched into an astonishing tirade against the banks. He gesticulated with both arms as he lit into us in elegant but angry French that I couldn't easily follow. I would get a blast of his invective before the translator clued me in on what he was saying. I suspect she deleted a few choice words. Okay, so you're watching. What do? I mean, you can't smile, right?
No, you just kind of try to impassively stare back and watch. You just watch, because it was a show. I mean, he was a showman, and I could tell that he was doing this not just for my benefit and not just for Jean Lemire's benefit, because he was a distinguished French banker, and he was catching a lot of the brunt of it. I mean, what was said about French bankers, I have not written all of that. Okay. And yet, as you may have noted at the end of it, what did Sarkozy do? He turned back and winked at us, as if, I hope you realize, Mr. Dallara and Mr. Lemire, that this was a show. And he turned it over to Merkel at that point, and a little sanity was restored.
It's interesting that he winked at you and not at Merkel.
Well, you know, I haven't encountered Mr. Sarkozy since the book was published, so I wonder what he would say. But the reality is that he was there. You know, this French-German relationship is so many layers of complexity that I don't begin to try to understand or analyze it. But he clearly wanted to demonstrate to all of us that he had a certain command of the moment. And it wasn't up to me to try to reject that notion. But as soon as he settled in and settled down and turned it over to Merkel, it was also really clear who was running the show. Okay. And it was not Sarkozy.
Well, we are live streaming, so he may be watching. So, we are now going to go to questions. Can you please put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question? Right down at the front, David.
Sorry, thank you, Charles, for your talk. I want to come back to France specifically. When entering these negotiations, did you notice any tensions between the partners, specifically France and Germany, over whether Greece should actually remain a member of the Eurozone during this crisis?
Yes, I thought one of the more fascinating developments during these negotiations, and to me one of the more troublesome developments, was that German officials, and not just German officials, but other Northern European officials, began to speculate publicly about the possibility that we would all be better off with Greece outside the Eurozone. I thought that reflected an utter lack of understanding of the damage that would be done to the entire credibility of the Eurozone at that point. And I remain rather convinced that if Greece had been pushed out, that it would have led to the unraveling of the euro as we know it today. I can't tell German political leaders how to do their job. That's their responsibility, responding to the German people. But I thought it was extremely unhelpful, and certainly from a market point of view, every time a German official would speak about Grexit, Greece leaving the euro, this stirred up more anxiety in the markets and made it more difficult for us to bring a restructuring to conclusion.
Martin.
You mentioned that we never got the fiscal union that was originally hoped would accompany monetary union, and I don't think we're ever going to get it. I mean, we seem to be moving further away from that than closer to that. Can you sustain a monetary union without fiscal union? Or to put it more bluntly, can the euro last over the long term?
In my view, and I regret to say this, but my view is the answer is no. But as Russell said in one of his recent lectures, where he was quoting another economist, when does something really become unsustainable? It's hard to pinpoint. But I don't see how this currency union could be sustained without an integrated fiscal framework to go alongside it, without a willingness to share risks and to mutualize the debt of the region as a whole. I know Europe is not America, and I understand the vast differences between the two. But if we had not successfully integrated the 13 colonies and agreed to mutualize the obligations of America at the start of our nation, I don't think we'd be around today. And I think the problem is a severe one, and I think the technocratic leaders and even some of the political leaders know this. But we're just swept up in a wave of populism today that seems to hand people what they think people want, which is simple answers to complex questions. And as long as our political leaders are unwilling to speak honestly to us about the complexity of many of the issues we face, from immigration to energy to the environment, the fact that these are not left or right, black or white issues, that they require a good bit of debate to find common ground. But that's not what the political leadership in my country or in many countries in Europe do today. They simply carve out one position and declare it to be the only position. And I think we're in a phase now of populist leadership that hopefully will not last too long. Even in my own country, I remain very concerned about our debt profile. And do I think our current mismanagement of our debt can be sustained indefinitely? No. I think the markets will call us, will call an end to this party at some point, and none of us know when. I'm shifting a bit away from the Eurozone to my own situation in America, where I think we have a growing vulnerability. Because if you looked at our campaign this year, no one, with the exception of one candidate, Nikki Haley, spoke about fiscal discipline for one moment. She was the only candidate that did, and I'm hopeful that she'll be a strong candidate 4 years from now, whoever wins the election next month. Because if we don't have political leadership to reconcile our fiscal imbalances, we know what will happen. The markets will finally hold us to reckoning, and it will be an uncomfortable reckoning.
Now, just on this integration in Europe, we've had something, and I want to ask you this as an ex-banker, something just happened of great interest. An Italian bank looks like it may be taking over a German bank. So I was in Frankfurt last week, and I was flying to Milan that evening. And when I was meeting lots of German investors, I said, well, this evening I'm flying to the center of German banking. It didn't go down very well. But it's interesting, for a generation it was always the German banks would take over, and that was somehow acceptable. It's inconceivable, isn't it, that an Italian bank could take over a German bank? And doesn't that tell us a little bit about this inability to integrate? Because it's not just fiscal integration, it's a bigger integration.
I'm going to answer this one and try to stay out of hot water with some of my friends in Germany and Italy. But, it's interesting because some 15 years ago, I don't remember exactly the date, this same Italian bank took over another substantial German bank. I think the name was Hippo Vereinsbank, wasn't it? And the reality is that it happened in a way that it did not stir up a lot of political debate, partly because the financial system was in such turmoil at the time. I think this is a sign of the inevitable consolidation of European banking. And I think that without commenting on this particular deal, because I can see it's still hotly being debated both between the banks and between the governments involved, and the ECB has a role in this as well. And it needs to be sorted out by those parties. It seems to me inevitable that you will see a phase of consolidation in European banking that will involve cross-border acquisitions.
Do we have any other questions from the floor? We have a Greek gentleman who would like to ask a question. Why don't we...
Yeah, as the resident Greek, let me bring it back to the Greeks. I thought you were very, very, very charitable about the role of the Greeks there. And, you know, we talked earlier, and I agree entirely with you that the structural problems and the corruption, the client state has very long political roots. But I want to ask you what you thought about the way that the Greeks handled the negotiations overall, because one thing that people like me were exasperated about our own government was that it was very inconsistent. Not the government, the governments, I should say, that you had someone like Papandreou that you mentioned who suddenly felt forced to call a referendum that was a political catastrophe. Then you had two different governments all saying, we are going to go back and renegotiate and get a better deal. And every time this was happening, there was more turmoil, more haircuts necessary, and more austerity and real misery in the street. As you mentioned, the level of unemployment in the end reached depression levels. I mean, we were talking 25, 30%. So how much in the end is the fault of the Greek political system? I'm not talking back in the 1970s, in the 2010s, which basically was not a consistent interlocutor, that they will do a deal and they will hold the deal, and it's not just the next election and some will promise, I'll get a better one, and cause more turmoil.
Well, I do have to agree with you that I think the Greek governments in general during this period of instability did not handle the negotiations with any consistency and with any degree of long-term strategy. I think part of the problem, though, and a major part of the problem is that they were unable to ever really take ownership because the negotiations were so heavily being influenced, I would even say almost controlled, out of Berlin, out of Washington, out of Frankfurt, and out of Brussels. And it was painful for me to see. I'd had difficult negotiations over the years with many sovereign debtors. And I sat across the table from Mexican and Argentinian and Philippine finance ministers and had long and difficult debates and negotiations when I was a Treasury official, trying to intermediate between the banks and these governments. But in this case, the Greek officials in these negotiations often had very little role in actually determining the outcome of the negotiations. And once you got into this political drama, when the New Democracy was kicked out in 2014, you brought in a whole bunch of astonishingly inexperienced people. And the Greek people, it was a statement of desperation by the Greek people. Unemployment was 29%. It's a wonder they didn't throw out democracy entirely and move into a whole different political system. Now, that's a bit of an exaggerated statement, but it's not too much. I mean, when you understand, no modern advanced economy has gone through such an extended period, massive unemployment like Greece did. And so the election of Syriza, vastly inexperienced, looking for solutions which they could not even begin to understand, I think was an indication that Greek people were desperate. And they tried this experiment for 4 or 5 years. They realized it did not work. And they went back to the old parties, but fortunately, new quality of leadership emerged. And I don't want to say this current Greek government has all the answers, but I have been quite impressed with their commitment to fundamental economic reform and revitalization of the Greek economy. My only concern is, you talk about sustainability. You know, how can this be sustained? Fortunately, the Greek people voted this Mitsotakis government in again last year for another 4-year term. So we've got a period of 8 years. But some of the problems run deep, and they're not going to be solved in 8 years. And this is where I go back to my notion that these are generational issues. Greece can build a competitive economy. And, you know, I speak now here with my investment hat on because I do work a good bit on behalf of a private equity firm headquartered in Switzerland. It's the largest private equity firm in Europe, and we acquired a Greek pharmaceutical firm 2 years ago, and it's been an outstanding investment for us. Investment capital is moving into Greece, and you're seeing the Greek economy now growing at a pace that is in excess of virtually all of the other European economies. And I think you're seeing capital move in there for serious investment, not just buying Greek government bonds, but buying competitive companies. There still is a lot to be done, and some of the real estate investment has a little bit of a boom dimension to it right now, which concerns me a little bit, as I know it does others. But I think that what Greece went through was so painful that, and the lack of control of these negotiations by the Greek governments, I don't want to excuse their mismanagement of it, but it was a period of extreme difficulty to be a Greek government official, and hopefully now Greece can stand on its own feet and be responsible for its own decisions.
We could have questions all night. You have to get to dinner. There's some people who want to meet you for dinner and get some advice about all sorts of things. You've come all the way to Edinburgh to do this. We're extremely grateful. Thank you very much. I know you love coming to Scotland. Come back.
Well,
do it again.
My wife, Pigeon, and I have thoroughly enjoyed our short visit here, although I will say that the first day we arrived Tuesday night was not the most welcoming around. It was rainy, it was cold, but today's sunshine lifted, and we'd be delighted to be back in Edinburgh, Scotland again.
Two things before you leave the stage. The first one is that tomorrow you'll get an invite to another event here. Jesse Norman, who some of you may have heard of, latterly of the British government, has written an excellent book on Adam Smith, and he'll be here to talk about that book, particularly in the light of the theory of moral sentiments, the half of Smith that disappeared but is maybe coming back. So look out for that. And also at the back of the room, this
copies of Euroshot.
There is nothing else like it, and there really isn't. And one day you may be rescheduling a sovereign debt somewhere. This will be the book you'll be picking up. So apologies we didn't have time for more questions, but Charles, wonderful to have you here. Please thank Charles for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me say, and I know you've got one other thing to do, but I just want to say, and it's not up for me to publicize my book at all. You've been very kind about it. But if you are in town in a couple of weeks, this presentation by Jesse Norman on Adam Smith, I've read the book recently, and it's a marvelous book. And I wish I could be here. I'll be looking at it on streaming. Okay.
I'm going to run over there now, okay? Just sit there.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Charles. It's great. Thanks.